Well, I know we did a couple of things.
Okay, good. Think back and let's talk about it. I had to look.
We talked about the whole thing.
There you go. That was the last thing. That was the last thing we talked about. This was our last test material. We talked about the election of 1876 when Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president. We talked about the difficulties he had, the differences between the stalwarts and the half-breeds, and there was a lot of trouble within the party. We talked about the election of 1880 when James Garfield was elected. We talked about his profile, including what happened to Garfield in a train station in D.C. He was assassinated. And we talked about Grover Cleveland being elected president as well. We talked about some important legislation that was passed in his presidency, the Presidential Succession Act, what happens if a president gets assassinated, what's the order, the electoral count, because we had problems, remember in that one election where they just made a deal and made Hayes president just on a deal, okay? We had the disputed returns in Florida and that type of thing. We talked about the Interstate Commerce Act that helped with transportation, then we talked about the election of Benjamin Harrison in 1888. And we talked a little bit about him, not a lot. We talked about the election of 1892, the election of 1896. It was just a lot of elections. And then we got into William McKinley being elected in 1896, and then we started having some trouble in Cuba. Remember, ironically, we were supporting the people of Cuba, which would not be the case when we get into the 60s. We talked about the sinking of the USS Maine. We talked about going to war with Spain, and the war was just like a summer long. We talked about what we gained from that. We gained some land in the Philippines, etc. And then we talked about the hero of the Spanish-American War, which was who? Teddy Roosevelt. And we talked about him a little bit. We talked about the fact that, remember, he was shot by an attempted assassin and it went through his glass case and a diary he had in his pocket. And we just basically talked about the books he wrote, The Winning of the West, etc., etc., etc. And what happened is when we talked about the election of 1914, we had a surprise candidate that won by the name of who? Anybody know? On your sheet there. Woodrow Wilson. That's kind of where we ended things up, and it would be a misnomer on my part to think you could remember all that, but we're going to have to do some review, obviously. So if you look at your topic and subtopic sheet here, we're talking about President Woodrow Wilson and America's entrance into World War I. Okay, we're going to get ourselves involved in a world war, the first one in our nation's history. And the subtopics, we're going to give you a quick profile on President Wilson. We're going to talk about how Europe entered into a world war. We're going to tell you what started World War I and the fact that America tried to stay neutral. We didn't jump right in the middle of this thing. And what kind of got us involved. We had a presidential election kind of during that time. And we'll kind of go through World War I. Okay, World War I was different than World War II. You don't have near the detail in a lecture that you normally would have in World War II, but it was an important battle, and it did kind of straighten some things up for the world. So, our overall topic is President Woodrow Wilson and America's entrance into World War I, and we're going to start now with our first subtopic of the year, Profile of President Wilson. Now, I guess we'll get to see where we're at here. Here's Woodrow Wilson right over the shoulder of John Kennedy. This is Woodrow Wilson right here. Okay? One of the first clean-shaven presidents in some time. You can think about how the styles changed. Okay, Woodrow Wilson, which is a little bit of a tongue twister. Woodrow Wilson was born on December 29th, 1956, and he was born in Virginia. He was born on December 29th, 1856 in Virginia. Now, Woodrow Wilson was not his given name. Woodrow is actually his middle name. His name was Thomas Woodrow Wilson, but he dropped his first name after he graduated from college. I don't know why, but he did. So his given name when he was born was Thomas Woodrow Wilson, but he dropped his first name after graduating from college. Now, this is kind of a weird question, but by looking at his appearance, kind of clean cut and stuff, what do you think his father did? What? What did his father do? What did you say? Did you say Lisa? He was a what? What was he, Courtney? What was he, Courtney?
He was a Courtney.
He was a minister. Okay? Okay? He was a minister. Shh. His father was a minister, and so he grew up on a daily diet of prayer and Bible readings. He was raised obviously in a very Christian family with his dad being a minister. Now he's born in 1856, so what's kind of going on in our history in 1856? Not quite, but about to get into it. Civil War. So he actually grew up in Georgia and was in Georgia during the Reconstruction. Can you imagine living in Georgia during the Reconstruction when Sherman went through there and made Georgia howl? I mean, think about what he went through. He lived in Georgia during the Reconstruction. He was there during that time in which the Union forces under General Sherman just scoured the land and just ruined it. He was there and witnessed it. And obviously his family supported what side in the Civil War? South. Okay, so he grew up as a Southerner. So he grew up in Georgia during the Reconstruction, went through that process of trying to reconstruct their state that had been totally devastated during the Civil War. His father supported the South. Matter of fact, during the Civil War, what do you think Wilson's father did with this church during the Civil War? He set it up very good, maybe as a hospital, and treated wounded Confederate soldiers. So his church in Georgia became a military hospital where many wounded Confederate soldiers were treated. Now, he was born in 1856, so by 1862, how old was he? Six-ish. Well, he didn't get to go to school until he was 9 because of the Civil War, right? I mean, it's raging, but his father taught him at home. So he didn't start school till he was 9 because of the Civil War, which was common among kids at that time. But his father taught him at home, and he got a very good education at home with his father. So he didn't start school till he was 9, but did get an education at home. He got such a good education, he was able to attend Princeton University, which is a Ivy League school, very prestigious college, university. So he left his school, formal school years, and attended Princeton University. And he actually was the editor of the college newspaper at Princeton during his senior year. You got journalism kids in here? None? You got yearbook kids I know that work hard. Same thing. He was the editor of his college newspaper during his senior year. I bet that was quite a responsibility, especially at Princeton. Well, he graduated from Princeton University in 1879. Graduated from Princeton University in 1879. And he went to graduate school. He wanted to continue his education. So he graduates from Princeton University in 1879. And then he enrolls in graduate school. And he goes to a very prestigious graduate school known as Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. So after graduating from Princeton University in 1879, he enrolled in graduate school at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. What do you think he studied there, Nick? Thinking about kind of what he ends up being, so to speak. What would he study at Johns Hopkins? Well, it's a good guess. Bailey? History and politics. Yep. History and politics. He studied history and politics, and he actually wrote his first book in 1885. He studied history and politics. He wrote his first book in 1885. 1885, wrote his first book. Anna, my dear, what do you think the name of that book was?
Congressional Government Studying American
Congressional Government, Studying American Politics. This is not a first edition by any stretch. That would be difficult to find. This is copyright 1994. It's just a reproduction, but this is the book that he wrote in 1885. Well, what do you think he did after he graduated from Johns Hopkins University, Chantel? What job did he have, do you think? What did he go do after he studied history and political science and wrote a book on it at Johns Hopkins? What job did he take? You don't get hired as the president or whatever, but what job did he take? Wasn't a job in politics. He didn't run for an office, so what job do you think he might have taken? What do you think he became after he graduated from Johns Hopkins? Shh. What? Anybody else want any? Nick, what do you think? Very good. He became a college professor in teaching history and political science. Where, Mackenzie? Where did he go to teach? He went, very good, my dear. He went back to Princeton. So after his graduation from Johns Hopkins University, he became a college professor, returning to Princeton University. Now you think about it. He graduated from Princeton in 1879. Probably took him a couple years to get out of graduate school or so. So we're looking at the early 1880s. By 1902, he was the president of Princeton University. That's how successful he was as a professor. So he taught there for a period of time, and finally in 1902 he became the president of Princeton. That's a pretty prestigious position to be in. Might be more prestigious than president at times, but anyway, he was president of Princeton. Well, had a little trouble at Princeton University. He found an enemy there, and the enemy turned out to be the dean of students. Okay, so every university has a president, a vice president, dean of students, and a financial officer, and those types of things. Does anybody know what a dean of students does at a university? I think it's myriad of jobs, but what are some things a dean of students might be involved in? What do you think? What? And he or she, if you're a dean of students, you might be involved a little bit with admissions, or be a head of admissions, or be the boss of admissions. What else? That's a good one. What else might you do? What's that? Student life. Yeah, be looking over what student life. You also are going to be, excuse me, the disciplinarian, so to speak, if a kid gets himself in a jam in college. You're going to oversee curriculum. You're going to have. I have a friend of mine, Brad Nason, who's the dean of students at Rocky Mount College. He's been there for 30 years. Graduated from Rocky, a little bit behind me, and went there, and he's been there ever since. He does a myriad of things at Rocky, but he's responsible for a lot of different things. Athletics, he oversees athletics, he oversees curriculum. He's kind of a guy that tries to keep the president out of trouble. So having an enemy in the dean of students, that would be bad. Okay, that'd be like the assistant principal and the principal just at odds all the time. That would never work. Well, what happened is Woodrow Wilson wanted to add a new graduate program at the university. The president of the university, Woodrow Wilson, wanted to add a graduate program at the university. And the dean of students was against that. He did not want to. But have you ever heard the expression, you won the battle but lost the war? Okay? And that's what happened with Wilson. He won the battle. He won the fight over adding the graduate program. But who did he anger in doing that? The dean. Guess what? The dean had a really good friend, alumni, that had a lot of money. A lot of money. So what do you think the dean did? Think about this. So let me put this back in perspective. The dean does not want the new graduate program. Wilson does. Wilson wins the battle but loses the war. And because the dean has a very wealthy alumni friend of Princeton. So what does the dean do? Carly, what do you think the dean do? Look, get your mischievous, ornery attitude out and tell me what you'd do if you were the dean, if you wanted to get back at it. What would you do if you had a very wealthy alumni in your back pocket, so to speak? Come on, girl. You're conniving enough. We all are. Sierra, what would you do? What do you think he did? What do you think that dean did with that really wealthy alumni guy in his back pocket? Well, who bought who? Bought who up? You're close. No, you think, no, don't give yourself bad self-esteem here. Who bought who out? You're on the right track.
The guy bought Wilson out.
Very good. And how did he do that, do you think? I think what you're thinking is, he went up to Will and said, hey, I'll give you a bunch of money if you leave, right? That kind of what you're thinking? Pretty close, that's very good. What he did is he said, you know, I'm about to give a large sum of money to the university under one condition. Wilson resigns. And that's what happened, okay? The rich alumni, see Sierra, you get your self-esteem up, girl, you were right on. What happened is this dean got to this rich guy that was already planning on maybe giving some money and said, hey, what do you think of Wilson? I don't like that SOB either. Well, let's figure this out. So basically he went in and said, you know, I'm prepared to give this large sum of money to Princeton University, but President Wilson, you got to resign. Do you think Wilson had to resign? This kind of guy was. He didn't have to be blackmailed, but he knew where the cards lay, and he wanted to see Princeton University, where he spent a big majority of his career, get this money, so he did resign. It was his choice, so I don't want you to think that, you know, he succumbed to pressure. He felt it was in the best interest of the university to get that money, so he did resign. So Wilson resigns as president of Princeton, and this big large sum of money from a wealthy alumni, spurred on by the dean of students, comes full circle to the university. Well, keeping up with his background, Gracie Macy, and what he studied, what do you think he did next? After he resigned he was a college professor, he then became the president of Princeton, which is a pretty prestigious thing. What do you think he did next in his life? He did, very good. He ran for governor of New Jersey, where Princeton University is. He ran for governor of New Jersey and was elected easily. Very popular man. So he left Princeton University and ran successfully for the governorship of New Jersey. Well, he had a good career as governor of New Jersey, and he was eventually in 1912 elected president of the United States. What party is he? Remember? You got a 50-50 shot here, Will. That a boy. He was Democrat. Now think about this. You don't remember, I'm sure, because it's been a summer, but he becomes the first Democratic president, he becomes the third Democratic president since the Civil War. The Democrats have just been getting crushed in these elections, one after another, since the Civil War. He becomes only the third Democratic president since the Civil War. So from 1865, basically, to 1912, he's only the third Democratic president. The Democratic Party was really in trouble. Now, historians will tell you that Wilson assumed the presidency with very few strings attached. Megan, what does that mean? Very few strings attached. Yeah, he wasn't connected to anybody, didn't owe anybody anything, didn't owe any political favors to anybody. He was one of the few presidents that ever assumed the presidency to that point that had very few strings attached. He didn't owe anybody anything. So he's all excited, and on March 4th, 1913, he's inaugurated into office as the President of the United States. Okay? March 4th, 1913, Woodrow Wilson is inaugurated, becomes the President of the United States. High hopes, thinking things are great. Less than 2 years later, the entire world is going to be at war. The entire world. So he begins his presidency on March 4th, 1913 with high hopes, and less than 2 years after his inauguration, the entire world will be at war. Okay? There's your profile on Woodrow Wilson. Okay, we'll move into our next subtopic then, which is Europe enters into a world war. You have to understand that we didn't get involved right away in this world war. Okay? We're going to try to sit back and we'll talk about that. Europe enters into a world war. Now let's think of our history a little bit. Nicholas, you want to start? Go ahead. Just stick your arm in there so you don't end up on the video. There you go. Have to take that in consideration. See, it's the first thing for everything. Now, when was the last time that Europe was involved in a major war? Think about our history. When's the last time we talked about being in any kind of a war where Europe was involved? Close, but it ended in 1850. Okay, so you have to remember that Europe had not experienced any major wars since 1850, almost 100 years. Okay, there were no conflicts in Europe. Well, you can imagine in the summer of 1914 when 5 major European countries went to war, it horrified everybody in the world. 5 major European countries are going to go to war with each other in the summer of 1914. Major deal when you haven't had any conflicts in Europe in almost 100 years. So you can imagine that people were horrified, they were very concerned, they were wondering when 5 major European countries went to war in the summer of 1914. Now, this war is going to be unlike any other war fought in American history because of the T word. What does that mean? Technology. Okay, and it's not going to compare to today, but the technology improvements in warfare from 1815 to 1914 is going to make this war like no other war we've ever experienced. And I'm going to give you 6 examples of modern technology that occurred between 1815 and 1914 that greatly enhanced the ability of one person to kill another. Okay? So, we're going to give you again 6 examples of modern technology since 1815 that will greatly enhance the ability of one human being to kill another. Pretty cool? Yeah. They don't let us set these. So, and let's think about you wartime people. Let's see. What would be a new technology